Most people see a biker walk into a gas station at midnight and they reach for their keys. They see leather, they see a beard and a back patch and hands like cinder blocks, and they see trouble, and they look away. That is what most people saw when Cole Brennan came in out of the rain that night. But there was one person in that gas station who did not look away. A little girl, maybe 7, watching him from behind a candy rack with eyes far too old for her face. And while he was paying for his coffee, she did something that would not make sense to him until he was already 40 miles down the highway. She slipped a folded piece of paper into his helmet, which he'd set on the counter, and she walked back to the woman waiting by the door without a word. He found the note at a rest stop, shaking the rain out of his helmet before he put it on. It was a torn corner of a coloring book page, folded small, and on it, in the careful, uneven letters of a child who has just learned to write, were 8 words. He breaks things when she cries. Please help. Cole Brennan sat on his bike in the dark and read those 8 words 4 times. And then he turned around. The gas station was a fuel stop on a stretch of state highway outside a town called Beaumont Hollow, Missouri, where the road ran flat and empty between fields, and the next town was 30 miles in either direction. At midnight, the place was an island of fluorescent light in a sea of black. The smell of burnt coffee and wet pavement and gasoline hung in the air. A cooler hummed somewhere in the back. The radio behind the counter played low. An old country station, the kind of song that has been playing in places like this for 50 years. This was the kind of gas station that used to be a real stop back when families drove these roads on Sundays, and now mostly saw truckers and night shift workers and people who were driving somewhere they didn't want to talk about. Cole Brennan had been one of those people that night, just passing through. He was 48, built wide and hard, with a beard going gray at the edges and a back patch that read Iron Vigil across the top. He had ridden with the same club for 26 years. People stepped back when Cole came into a room the way they always had, and most of them never learned the rest of it. They never learned that Cole had spent 11 years as a volunteer with a domestic crisis network, riding escort for women who needed to get out and stay gone. They never learned that he did it because of his own mother, and a man Cole still did not talk about, and a childhood spent learning to read the weather in another person's hands. They never learned that the thing Cole was best at in the whole world was noticing the small signs that something was wrong in a house. Because he had grown up inside one, he was riding home from a long week. He wanted 10 quiet minutes and a hot coffee in the empty road. He carried, the way he always carried, a quiet weight he never set down. The memory of a woman who had not gotten out in time when he was too small to help her. He had decided a long time ago that no child would stand near him and need help and not get it. He just hadn't expected to be tested on it at a gas station at midnight. Before we go any further, do me one favor. Hit subscribe and drop your hometown in the comments below. I want to see how far this story reaches tonight. I read every single one. Now, back to that little girl and the 8 words she risked everything to write, because what Cole was about to walk back into was more dangerous than anything he'd faced in 26 years on the road. The little girl's name was Maddie. He would learn it later, when it was safe to ask. She was 7 years old, small for it, in a thin jacket zipped all the way to her chin, even though they were indoors. She had the kind of stillness that no 7-year-old should have, the stillness of a child who has learned that being noticed can be dangerous, who has spent her whole short life reading a room before she steps into it. She watched everything from the edges. She had a habit of holding the cuff of her own sleeve, twisting at a small private thing she did with her hands, when she was afraid, which was most of the time. She had a stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere, gray and flat from washing, missing one button eye. It was the only thing that was fully hers. She had named it herself a long time ago, back when she was small enough to still say things out loud at the dinner table, before she learned which nights it was safer to say nothing at all. She slept with one arm around it and one ear open. And earlier that day, in the back seat of a car on a long highway she didn't recognize, she had torn a corner off her coloring book and pressed the letters out one at a time the way her teacher had shown her before they moved and she'd stopped going. Because she had figured out something a 7-year-old should never have to figure out, that she could not say the words out loud, that the only way to ask for help was to hand it to a stranger and hope. The woman by the door was Maddie's mother. Her name was Dana, and she was 29 and looked 40, and she stood the way Maddie stood, Small, watchful, ready to apologize for taking up space. She had a fading mark along her jaw that she had covered with makeup that didn't quite cover it. And standing close beside her, one hand resting on the back of her neck in a way that looked almost gentle if you didn't know better, was the man. His name was Wade. He was not the kind of man who shouts in a gas station. He was the worst kind. He was calm. He was pleasant to the cashier. He smiled easily, and he kept one hand always touching Dana or Maddie on a shoulder, on the back of the neck, a hand that said without a word that they belonged to him and were not going anywhere. Intimate cruelty does not need to raise its voice. It uses what it knows. And Wade knew exactly where every bruise was because he had put them there. And he knew that all he had to do in a public place was rest his hand on the right spot, and the woman beside him would go quiet and steer the child toward the car. Cole had clocked all of it in the 4 minutes he was inside, the way Dana flinched when Wade's hand moved, the way Maddie watched the exits, the mark on the jaw. He had seen this exact picture more times than he wanted to count, and every instinct he'd built over 11 years had gone off at once. But he'd had no proof and no standing, and a man like Wade does not respond to a stranger's hard look. So Cole had paid for his coffee and walked out into the rain, telling himself he would find another way. And then he'd found 8 words inside his helmet, and there was no other way to find. Cole did not come back fast. That was the thing. He came back slow, and he came back smart, because he had done this enough times to know that the most dangerous moment for a woman and a child in that situation is the moment a well-meaning stranger comes charging in and forces the man's hand in public. So before he turned his bike around, he made 2 phone calls. The first was to a domestic crisis hotline he had on speed dial to get a shelter bed confirmed and an advocate on the line who knew the law. The second was to a brother named Hollis, who happened to be a county sheriff's deputy 2 towns over and off duty, and who answered on the second ring because Cole did not call at midnight for nothing. "There's a woman and a little girl at the fuel stop on Route 7, Cole said, "and a man who hurts them. I need it done right." Wade had stopped for gas or maybe coffee, or maybe just to remind the 2 of them how long the night could be. Cole parked, and he walked inside slow, and he did not look at Wade at all. He went to the counter, he bought another coffee he didn't want, and he positioned himself the way you learn to, between the family and the door. Wade noticed him. Of course he did. A man like Wade is always watching the room. "Help you with something?" he asked, pleasant as anything. "Nope," Cole said. He didn't look up from his coffee. The cashier, a kid barely out of high school, had gone quiet behind the register, and a lone trucker getting coffee by the back wall had stopped pouring and was very carefully not turning around. Everyone in that gas station could feel that something was wrong. That was the thing about it. Everyone always could, and everyone always did exactly what these 2 strangers were doing now, which was nothing, because Wade had not technically done anything, because he never technically did, and because a calm man with his hand on a child's shoulder is not a thing the world has ever known what to do with. Maddie was standing near the candy rack again. Cole crouched down slow, the way you'd approach a deer, and pretended to look at the bottom shelf, and without turning his head, he said very quietly, "Just for her, I got your note. You're real brave. You're not in trouble. Just stay close to me." The little girl's eyes filled, and she gave the smallest nod a person can give, and she twisted the cuff of her sleeve. That was when Wade crossed the floor. He came over with the same easy smile, but his eyes had gone flat. He put himself between Cole and Maddie, and he set his hand on the back of the little girl's neck, and he said, still pleasant, still calm, "We're going to get going. Family time. You understand." Dana had risen from her seat by the door. "Wade," she said very softly, the way a person says a name when they have learned that the saying of it can cost them. "He's not bothering anybody. Let's just go." She was not asking Cole to leave. She was trying to make herself small enough that the night would not get worse, and Cole knew that, and it was the saddest thing in the room. Wade did not even look at her. His eyes stayed on Cole, his hands stayed on the girl. He had decided this was a thing between men now, and Dana had ceased in his mind to be a person who got a vote. Cole stood up, slowly, all of him. The rack of candy seemed to shrink beside him. "Take your hand off her," Cole said. It was not loud, it was 4 words, and the gas station went so quiet that the only sound was the cooler humming in the back. Wade's smile thinned. He kept his hand where it was, because men like Wade understand that the hand is the whole conversation. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice dropping low so it carried only to Cole, "but this is my family, and you're about to make a very bad mistake. I know people in this county. I know how this goes. You put one finger on me and you're the one in cuffs tonight, and they go home with me anyway. Is that what you want for them?" It was the smartest thing he could have said, and it was true enough to land, because that is exactly how it usually goes. Cole did not move. He did not put a finger on him. He just looked at Wade, and then he tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he hears something far off. Because there was a sound, low and distant, coming up the empty highway from the west. A rumble. The kind that comes up through the ground before it reaches the ears. "What's that?" Wade said. Cole almost smiled. It was not a kind smile. "That's the part where you were wrong about how this goes." Headlights swung into the lot. One set, then more behind it, then more, until the wet, black highway was a river of moving light, and the windows of the gas station trembled in their frames. The engines arrived before the riders did. The sound rolled across the empty fields and broke against the glass, and the floor itself seemed to hum with it. Then they came in, rank after rank, headlights sweeping across the lot, chrome shining under the fluorescent glow, and they did not race and they did not roar. They came in slow and ordered, the way people come when someone has put out a call and not one of them stopped to wonder whether they should answer it. 231 motorcycles filled the lot of that gas station and lined both shoulders of Route 7 before the rain had let up. They parked in rows, and then, row by row, the engines died. And then there was silence. The silence of more than 200 riders standing in a rain-slicked parking lot is not something you can describe to a person who hasn't stood inside it. It is heavier than any noise. Wade stood by the candy rack with his hand still on the little girl's neck, and the color had drained out of his pleasant face. And in the same moment, a county sheriff's cruiser turned in off the highway. No siren, just a slow sweep of its lights, and Deputy Hollis stepped out into the rain in his department jacket, with another unit right behind him. The riders came in through the doors, not all at once, but quietly filling the space. And not one of them looked at Wade. They looked at the woman by the door. An older woman in a faded vest reached Dana first and stood beside her, not touching her, just close, a wall between her and the man. Then a road captain came forward, gray all the way through his beard, slow on a bad knee, and he did not so much as glance at Wade as he passed him. He crouched down in front of Maddie, way down, so a 7-year-old would not have to look up at one more big man, and his rough voice came out soft. "You wrote that note?" he asked. Maddie nodded, twisting her sleeve. "That was the bravest thing I ever heard of," the road captain said. 200 of us rode out here tonight because of 8 words you were brave enough to write. You hear me? You're not in trouble. You're not going anywhere you don't want to go. Not ever again." Behind him, 200 riders stood without a sound. It was Deputy Hollis who handled Wade because that was how it was supposed to be done, and Cole had built the whole night so it would be. The advocate Cole had called was already on the phone with Dana, quiet and steady, telling her about the shelter bed, telling her she had options she had been made to believe she didn't have. Wade tried, once, the way they do. He talked about his rights. He talked about the people he knew. He said the woman would never testify, that she never did, that by morning none of this would stick. The road captain looked at him then. For the first time, the way you look at something you've decided is not worth the trouble of stepping on. Maybe it sticks, and maybe it doesn't, he said. That's the law's problem now, and the law's standing right there. But here's what's not in question. She's not getting in that car, and 200 of us are going to know your name and your face by morning, and we are going to be watching every road you drive for the rest of your life. He let that sit. So you can make this hard, or you can let the deputy do his job. Your choice. We've got all night. Wade did his arithmetic. The lot full of light, the badge, the phone call already happening. He lost. They put him in the back of the cruiser, and he did not get a dramatic exit because he did not deserve one. The cruiser pulled out, and nobody watched it go. The law is never simple in these cases. Cole knew that better than anyone, and he did not pretend otherwise to Dana, sitting with her in the bright lot, while the advocate talked her through what came next. But some things were no longer in question. Dana and Maddie did not get in that car. They spent that night in a shelter bed that Cole had confirmed before he ever turned his bike around. The door locked, an advocate down the hall, the first night in longer than Dana could remember, that she fell asleep without listening for footsteps. In the weeks that followed, there were orders filed, and a long road through the courts and the slow, careful work of building a life with a lock on the door. None of it was easy, but it was theirs now, and it was moving in one direction, away. And the club did not just ride off and forget them, the way the world usually does. There was a fund, quietly arranged, the way road captains arrange things. There were rides to court dates so Dana never had to walk in alone. There was a name and a number for the bad nights. Cole came by when he was passing through, and he always announced himself at the door first, gently, because he understood that a sudden big man in a doorway was a thing that family had earned the right to fear, and he was teaching them slowly that not every big man was that. The young cashier from that night could not stop talking about it. He told the story to everyone who came through. On the night shift, how he'd watched 200 motorcycles fill the lot in the rain. How he'd felt ashamed that he had stood there and done nothing while a little girl twisted her sleeve 6 feet from his register. And how he had decided that night that he would never be a person who looked away again. Small things. But the kind of small thing that means a story has changed somebody. One afternoon, weeks on, Maddie handed him another folded piece of paper. His hands were not steady when he opened it, because the last note had said what it said. But this one had a drawing on it, in crayon, of a little girl and a gray rabbit and a man on a motorcycle, and underneath, in careful, uneven letters, 3 words. You came back. Cole Brennan, who people crossed rooms to avoid, sat in a shelter common room and looked at 3 words drawn in crayon and could not say anything at all. For a long while. Some people think the bravest thing in the world is to be big and loud and strong enough that no one can hurt you. They are wrong. The bravest thing this state ever saw was a 7-year-old who could not say the words out loud, folding 8 of them into a stranger's helmet because some small, fierce part of her still believed that somewhere out there somebody would come. If this story reached you, if you believe that the smallest, quietest cry for help still deserves an answer, hit that like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that asking for help is the bravest thing a person can do. Subscribe so you never miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, who was the person who came back for you when you needed it? I read every single one. This story deals with domestic abuse. If you or someone you know is in an unsafe situation, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-723-3 or by texting START to 88788.